Greetings and welcome to another online edition of History 1301. If you've been following along closely, you know that we have been talking about a process of transition in the American economy that we've loosely referred to as the American Industrial Revolution. Now, you should be quite familiar at this point in time that the Industrial Revolution was simply a process in which human or animal power was replaced by machine power. We could see this in several different ways. One of the most vivid ways that we could see this was through the use of something like the Waltham power loom. And if you remember correctly, what that power loom is doing is it's automatically weaving thread into textile and thereby replacing human labor, and at the same time producing a quantity that's far, far exceeding that a human being would be able to produce. So on the one hand, what the Industrial Revolution has done, and is continuing to be in the process of doing, is providing more for less, which brings down prices, which raises the American standard of living. So on that particular point, it's a good thing. But there again, and we asked this question the other day, what happened to the skilled worker, the weaver, that it put out of business? So you can see that it works both sides of the way. Now, on another point, I'd like it to be known that the Industrial Revolution is presenting additional opportunities, more freedom, I guess you could say, in American life. But just like there's another side to every story, the Industrial Revolution is also threatening freedom simultaneously. Let me explain what I mean. One of the things that you begin to see in the late 18th and early 19th century is the expansion of markets, and we certainly saw that through the case of the shoemaker the last time we met. There was once upon a time that each shoemaker not only produced under his own roof, a 10-foot shed at the back of his home, but he produced for a very local clientele base. When you needed a new pair of shoes, you went to go see this guy, and when he made you a pair of shoes, first of all, he made them explicitly to fit your foot, and secondly, this was not mass-produced. What changes is that some of these master shoemaker craftsmen are beginning to sell to a much broader audience, and what that means is they can no longer take the time to intimately measure feet. They're producing shoes, but they're producing them to fit a general clientele basis, a much more watered down clientele base. Okay? If this is going to work, or maybe to get the most bang for your buck, industrialization is going to play a key role. Now, what I mean is, you're going to need to mass produce these products, and when you do that, when you mass produce them, first of all, you're going to be producing in a much more general format, so you'll see the implementation of standardized sizes. But more importantly, you're going to lower the cost of production. Now keep in mind, when that master shoemaker would make you a pair of shoes, he would make them from the soles up, so this would take a long time. Once the market's expanded, shoemakers no longer had that luxury, and so what they needed to do was find a way to drive down the overhead cost of production. One of the ways of doing that is the centralization of production. Think of a factory. What a factory essentially is a centralized point of production. Every step of the production process is centralized right there within the factory. Raw goods and material come in one end, and what leaves on the other end is manufactured, finished, ready-to-consume products. What's happening in the case of the shoemaker and the rise of these factories in places like Lynn, Massachusetts, is you're seeing a sharp division of labor within inside the factory. For instance, there is one guy on the conveyor belt, picture an assembly line, and what he does is he just slices the leather. He cuts it into a particular shape. That's all he does all day long. And this conveyor belt, the assembly line, is bringing him that leather, and then when he's done cutting it, it's passing it on to another guy who sews it to the bottom part of the shoe. And then that other guy has that shoe moved down to another person who puts laces in it, and it moves down to another person that puts it into the box, and you get the idea, right? It's a much more efficient way to produce shoes, And anytime you're more efficient at producing things, you're going to lower the overhead cost of producing it. And when that happens, you can sell it for a lower price. When that happens, more people can afford to buy it, and the standard of living in America generally goes up. Shoes become cheaper, so not only can you buy more of them, you've got more money to spend on other things. Okay? The downside is the division of labor. There's a clip that I put into this week's folder that I'd like you to watch. I think that many of you will find it kind of humorous. It's a Charlie Chaplin film called Modern Times. And if you watch the first few minutes, watch the first 5 or 10 minutes of that film, and you'll get a really vivid understanding of what it meant to work on an assembly line, doing one thing over and over and over and over and over again, hour after hour, day after day, week after week, month after month. As you might imagine, this is really going to take a toll on people's bodies. It's hard to keep up with that kind of pace of work. It's boring, it's monotonous, it's highly conducive to the idea of an industrial accident happening. As a matter of fact, if you watch that film a little bit further, you'll see that there's a point that he actually gets sucked into the machine and he goes through the gears, and it's supposed to be humorous. After all, it is a comedy, but the point is well taken, I think. So anyway, there's an upside to this issue of industrialization as it relates to the Industrial Revolution. There's also a downside. And the downside, one of the things that I'd like you to be particularly mindful of, is this is going to jeopardize the concept of America the Great Exception. America that you can be born into humble origins and rise as high as your talents would take you. Well, if you are born into humble origins and necessity forces you into this factory, you're at a really big disadvantage when it comes to not only being dependent upon your boss for that job, but generally speaking, once you are engulfed in that particular socioeconomic background, it's going to be more and more difficult to break out of it. You'll see why a little bit later in this lecture. For the time being, I'd like to talk a lot about the textile industry. Now, whether you're talking about America in the early 19th century or China in the 21st century, the lifeblood of any industrial economy is textile. Okay? And at this particular moment, the British are dominating the textile industry. Now, America's only beginning to understand how rich and powerful the textile industry can make a country, so we've got a very big incentive to try to do things to compete with the British. Now, we do have some advantages, meaning that our shipping costs are much lower than theirs, considering we grow the cotton in the American South, and it's got to go a lot shorter of a distance to reach its destination point in places like Lowell, Massachusetts. But at the same time, they had a very big head start on us, so we've got a lot of ground to make up. One of the things that American policymakers are going to try to do when it comes to making American textile producers more competitive, they're going to issue tariffs on British textiles. Now, this is going to be all fine and good in places like Massachusetts and Philadelphia, places where American industry had taken heavy root and workers as well as factory owners could see a direct benefit in this. It's going to be far more controversial in states like Georgia or South Carolina, states that don't have heavy industry, and furthermore see the tariff as the government artificially raising the cost of living. In other words, if I live in South Carolina and I don't care where my textile comes from, I don't have an incentive to buy American versus buying British, I'm going to buy the cheapest product in town, and that just so happens to be the British. So from the perspective of people like John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, what this is doing is the government is picking and choosing winners in the American economy. In this case, it's choosing to raise the cost of the British product to where it's more expensive than the American product, simply to appease the factory owners in places like Lowell, Massachusetts. So keep in mind, everybody, there's an upside and a downside to virtually everything. And at the same time that the Industrial Revolution and the rise of the factory system has the potential to make America a rich and powerful nation, it also has the ability to expand the institution that is government, and that can be a very slippery slope. We've also talked about the recruitment of a labor force in places like Lowell, Massachusetts. For those of you that recall, Lowell was one of the earliest textile manufacturing centers in American history, and it was one of America's first industrial boomtown cities. We remember that when it comes to the recruitment of a labor force, most of the town fathers in Lowell looked to the countryside and they recruited young women, girls as young as 16 years old, all the way up through about 23. So these are young, energetic female workforce that's entering into the factories. Now, we've talked about some of the reasons why they were hiring women. In his report on manufacturers, Alexander Hamilton actually advocated not only the hiring of women, but also children, primarily because they were a cheap source of labor. And if we're going to get this industry off the ground, then what we need to do is cut overhead costs, primarily for production, as much as we possibly can. So, when people are recruited into Lowell's factories, they're primarily recruited for their cheap labor. In the 1840s and 50s, what you're going to see is some fairly significant social upheavals in places like Germany, but more importantly, Ireland. You're going to see the potato crop fail, which was the main source of nutrition for Irish people. And when this happens, one of the places that they begin going is the Northeast, and Massachusetts in particular. And when they go, they look for any job that they possibly can find, and one of the places that is hiring are the textile mills. So what you're seeing here is this race to the bottom. What had at one point in time been the main source of employment for American-born women, which gave them more and more financial opportunities, which consequently translated into more and more political freedoms, is now being eroded by this influx of immigrant labor. Now, it's not as if the immigrants are doing this on purpose. They're doing it out of economic necessity. But ultimately, what they're giving here is the factory owners a justifiable reason for lowering the wages of the working class inside the factories. So what started out as a great opportunity for women to go and earn their own money ultimately turned into this situation where they're seeing their freedom and their opportunity continuously cut and eroded. Reread Harriet Martineau on the morals of the manufacturers, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. The last thing that I'd like you to understand about the factory system is we're continuously looking for new and improved ways to make those factories more efficient. New technology that's being introduced on an everyday basis that helps factory owners approach their production in a scientific method. Now, to that end, one of the things that we see arise is something called the Franklin Institute, and it was named after Benjamin Franklin. And if you recall our discussion of Franklin, he was the farm boy that kind of liked to tinker with things, right? So he was sort of like this amateur scientist, and naturally the Franklin Institute was a place where people of that mindset could go and experiment with things that may or may not improve the method of production. So on an everyday basis, we're seeing ways that are being adopted through the Franklin Institute and implemented in the factory systems of ways to cut overhead costs. Some of these ways are really progressive in the sense that they're safer, they cost less money. Some of them are quite destructive in the sense that they're putting people out of work. Now, all of this leads us to the rise of a very politically conscious working class. And certainly Sam Patch, the main character of your reading, would qualify as one of these people that is very politically conscious in these days, the days of industrialization. There's a lot of people that begin asking the question why. Why is it that the factory owners have so much power when it comes to influencing politics? Why is it so that they have so much power within the factory? They can tell the workers this is the way that it's going to be, and there's very little things that the workers can do to oppose this. So out of this industrialization process, you're going to see the rise of unions. And for those of you that are unfamiliar with the term union, it's a collection of workers, like an alliance of workers, that go ahead and bargain collectively with their bosses. They make the case that we're not going to work for less than this amount of money per hour. They make the case that we're not going to go back to work until you improve the safety precautions of the factory, or you give us a break every so many hours. In short, they're able to negotiate the terms of their employment. This is a direct response to what's happening on the inside of the factory. Okay? But the question that many people were beginning to ask is, where is the democracy for the working man? Or in many cases, the working woman? Now, what a lot of these workers wanted to see was something that they called Artisan Republicanism. Okay? Now, the word artisan just simply meant skilled craftsman, a highly trained worker. Now, you know what republicanism means. It's a form of government that's not a monarchy, it's not inherited. So Artisan Republicanism, right, what they're talking about is working class democracy. That the idea here is that all men are created equal. It says so in the Declaration of Independence. Whether or not Jefferson actually meant white working men is another story, but nonetheless, a lot of these workers are saying this applies to me. And what I'm seeing happening here is my freedom, my opportunity, my autonomy, my ability to pursue my own self-interest is being continuously undercut by the power of these factory owners. So what needs to happen is we need to empower a working class to be able to take on what comes to be known as the aristocracy of capital. Okay? Now if you think about it, aristocracy, what that word means is landed wealth. Well, you can't really call them landed wealth because what the factory owners own is not necessarily land as much as it is the means of production. They own the factories, they own the machines on the inside of the factories. They have capital, meaning they have the financial resources to run those factories. And so what you're beginning to see through the rise of industrialization is a very small collection of individuals that yield a lot of political, a lot of economic power. And in short, this is exactly what Thomas Jefferson had warned us about. This is exactly why he wanted to see an agrarian economy as opposed to Alexander Hamilton's industrial economy. So what you're beginning to see here through this politically charged working class are more and more Americans that are appealing to more and more elected officials or people that are even running for political office to enact laws and to enact policies that would empower people at the grassroots levels of the American economy. One example that I want to point to before we break, the labor theory of value. Now, if you think about it, a shoe only has value if it's found to be useful. I mean, outside of its use as protection for your foot, really all it is a collection of leather, plastic, cloth, you name it. So you have to ask yourself, how did that go from being a collection of raw materials to a finished, ready-to-consume product that somebody actually valued? And according to the labor theory of value, what it emphasizes is some worker imposed his or her intellectual capacity on it. So it was transformed from a collection of raw materials into an actual manufactured good that somebody wanted to buy. And so what the labor theory of value emphasized is anytime there's added value to raw materials, in other words, anytime a worker produces a product, the added value needs to be paid to the worker, not to the middleman, in other words, the guy that owns the factory. Okay? So the labor theory of value is one way of empowering the working class by rewarding labor or somebody's intellectual capability to produce rather than somebody's ability to own the means of production. What industrialization ultimately is, guys, is a good thing and a bad thing at the same time. It's a good thing for obvious reasons. We now have more food, we have more clothing, we have more finished products. This is good because it raises the standard of living. It enhances our economy. It complements our economy. It modernizes our economy. But at the same time, and this is not the last time that you'll see this, industrialization systemically threatens the institution of American freedom and equality. Okay? What you're seeing emerge is a political situation and to some extent a social situation where people are getting off this path of America the Great Exception. The patches are probably a prime example of that. Sam Patch is a factory worker primarily because his father made poor decisions, and they entered into the labor market in the sense that they became factory workers. Once they became factory workers, it was increasingly difficult to break that cycle, primarily because they had very little control over their working life, and the people that were writing the laws or influencing the laws at the highest level were not the people of the working class variety. So I want you to understand that this is a good thing and a bad thing at the same time, and really this is going to have a very heavy impact on American politics, especially by the time that we get to the 1820s and everybody can get a good up-close and personal look at industrialization. In short, it's really going to be influential in the life and times and political career of Andrew Jackson. But for right now, that's where we're going to leave it. Continue reading Sam Patch.